has been working with the EEC to support Michael Liebreich's visit here to Australia, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Bill, who is going to welcome Michael. And now you need to welcome Bill so he can welcome Michael. Please put your hands together.
Welcome to the circus. So thank you very much. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker, Michael Liebreich. RACE is really enthusiastically sponsoring this session here today at the EEC National Conference. Michael is an internationally renowned thought leader in clean energy, sustainability and finance. He asked me not to, but here's a list of a number of different things that he's currently doing. He's co-managing partner of Eco Paper Capital, CEO of Liebreich Associates, founder and co-host of the Cleaning Up podcast and YouTube channel, and founder and regular and senior contributor to Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And any of you that have worked in any part of systems modelling, for instance, would have used a number of the BNF Group products. While he's here in Australia, Michael will also host a number of Cleaning Up podcasts. I think he's done 2 to date. He's going to run sessions with his leadership circle, and next week he'll be presenting at the National Press Club on Tuesday. We're very excited to learn from Michael on this visit, but equally, we're eager for Michael to learn about the great work that our researchers, our industry, and our government are doing. So please welcome Michael to the stage.
Thank you very much. I feel very welcomed, and it's great to be here. So what I'm doing down here in Australia, as Bill said, is it's not even a whistle-stop tour because it's a couple of weeks, and recording our first mini-series on Australia, which will be on Australia, and I'm talking to lots of people for Cleaning Up. So if you want to know what I'm doing here, just wait a few weeks until that starts to come out. And it's been already. I'm absolutely convinced I'm learning much more than I could probably possibly impart. But what I want to do is take a kind of very high-level world tour and then try and land it exactly where we're headed on electrification. So I can try and put the electrification challenge that you face and that Luke and Secretary Anthony talked about in the last session, to try and put that in some context. So global, let's start at the biggest picture we can, and we've got this crisis going on. So one of the big questions is, how is that going to play out? Because it actually, and we see it through the price signals that are put in the market, into fossil fuels, into oil and gas. But it's also going to put a signal into the policy environment. It already is. And there's these kind of 2 points of view. You know, these are just news stories, and over on the left is the one that we would like to believe is going to win, which is that we've got to get off fossil. The only way to protect ourselves is to get off fossil fuels, so that resilience and climate are then pulling in the same direction. But there is, of course, another, a whole other constituency that are saying the reason that we've got these problems is that we took our eye off the ball. We all worried much too much about climate, and we didn't make our fossil supply chains resilient. We should have dug more, drilled more, extracted more, and we'd be in a better place. And that's the debate that we're having, and hopefully at the press club I'll be able to help nudge that in a useful direction, let's say. But what you've got there is the oil price, and you see a lot of commentators saying, oh, this is the second oil crisis in 4 years. And I want us all to push back on that, because the reality is actually that this is the 14th oil crisis in 60 years. That's if you count crises where the price goes up and crises where the price goes down. Because if you're a producing nation, then actually the crash is just as painful for them as the price increases for us, and just as disruptive. You only have to think back to things like the Arab Spring to know that these can be really disruptive. So obviously for the consuming nations, it's the spikes up. So then I think there's, of the 14, there's sort of 7 or 8 spikes upwards, and 5 or 6 spikes downwards. But the reality is not when people say fossil fuels is what drives prosperity and fossil fuels, and then they make out that what you get is sort of long periods of wealth and prosperity and then the occasional wobble, 1970 and then now. Well, actually, you've got once every 4 years, the global economy is convulsed because of fossil fuel shocks. And the clean energy sector gets told, well, you say clean energy is cheap, but it's not because of externalities. And nobody quantifies the externalities of what happens to the economy when oil prices shoot up 30% in a few months or down 30% in a few months. So that's what's happening, and I think the narratives that need to come through is this is incredibly damaging, and it's not going to stop. It's not like this is going to be the last crisis, the last price spike in fossil fuels, or the last collapse in fossil fuel prices. This is going to continue. So I think we can draw some lessons for what happens next from the situation after Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And what happened after that, we had similar sort of discussions about finding alternative sources, because in Europe we were suddenly not able to use Russian oil and gas in most of the countries. And what we saw was what I call the Great Clean Energy Acceleration. And in response to the crisis of the Strait of Hormuz, we're going to see some more exploration, and we're going to see a bit of a return to coal and those things. But mainly what we're going to see over the next few years, I believe, is the Great Clean Energy Acceleration 2.0. So let's look at what happened back then. That was investment. I started, as Bill said, New Energy Finance, then it was Bloomberg New Energy Finance, logging the money flows into clean energy. That was where we started. And there you can see investment by technology. Renewables investment was less than, I think it was $36 billion in 2004 when I first counted it. Then you put the grid on top, the green bit, and it's now over $2 trillion per year. But that is what I call the Great Clean Energy Acceleration. And I think what we're going to see now is another turn of the screw, another increase in the amount invested in the clean solutions. And this time it's going to be Asia that is most closely affected by the Strait of Hormuz. The stuff that goes through the Strait of Hormuz, the oil and gas, mainly goes to Asia, yourselves as well. So that was the impact of Russia, the withdrawal of Russia supplies to Europe, which pushed prices up, and of course China and others responded, but I think we're going to see that, I'm not sure if I can say on steroids, but another turn of the screw. Now that was money. This is what was being added to the grid, and there you can see the Great Clean Energy Acceleration, so that around the world, more than 90% of the technologies, the generating capacity being added to the electrical system is now just two technologies, wind and solar, that were, I don't want to say almost non-existent, but they were not significant in any way back in 2004 when I started New Energy Finance. And then if you look at, that's capacity, everybody knows capacity is great but irrelevant in terms of actual electricity mix. This is the output. And the green line is non-hydro renewables, mainly wind and solar. And the fun thing is, when I started New Energy Finance, it was the most dynamic, incredibly exciting thing ever to work on, and it's now the little flat bit of the line, because that's what the beginning of a sigmoid curve or what exponential growth will do to you. Right now we're in the middle of a battery revolution. It feels so dynamic with the volume of batteries we're going to see in a second growing so fast. That too will look like the flat bit of the curve. In 10 years' time, you'll look back and go, what were we actually doing? Was anything actually happening? Because it looks completely flat, because the scales just change. So there's the Great Clean Energy Acceleration. 20% of all electricity globally is now produced by wind and solar, which used to be called alternative energy, and people were surprised when I started New Energy Finance, my friends thought that I'd thrown away my entire career. And look at me today. This is batteries. So that was a forecast made by Bloomberg New Energy Finance. But the team that I trained in 2019 forecast, and that's the Great Clean Energy Acceleration. And as I say, all you need to do is think about what that chart will look like in 10 years' time, and that will be flat. That'll be the bit where you think, well, nothing much is happening. That's the reality. And then it's not just the electrical, it's not just the grid and the generating capacity and the batteries, it's also vehicles, and there, the Great Clean Energy Acceleration. And obviously you've got, the US off doing its thing and it's not accelerating in the same way. I don't know why that is. I have to drill in there. But we are seeing it pretty much around the world. And I'm going to draw on, this is from Ember. I'm afraid it's not very easy to see, but this really sums it up. A brilliant piece of work. They call it the electrotech revolution. Because it's not just generation of electricity, and it's not just new ways of integrating it, batteries, also HVDC and all those sorts of things. And it's not just new ways of using electricity, EVs and heat pumps and so on. It's when you do all three at once that you get something extra happening. And they call this the electrotech revolution. Around the world, obviously, if we start, China profoundly gets this. And they got it 15 years ago. And in some ways, they've been playing chess, whilst we, in the rest of the world, have been playing drafts. And the US now is playing, air guitar. So China has gone from the number 5 exporter of cars to the number 1 in 3 years. Now, it's not only exporting electric cars, but it is increasingly exporting electric cars. And you see it here, the BYDs. I've driven in a couple of BYD Ubers. The UK, there's a BYD showroom about a kilometre from my house. And that was unthinkable 3 years ago that we would be driving Chinese cars in the UK, but like we now are. And you see train after train coming from the ports to the showrooms of Chinese cars. Europe, of course, has put tariffs, the US has put tariffs. This feels very much like, for those of you that can remember, I notice I'm the only one with a tie, so maybe I'm the only one who can remember, the 1970s and Japanese cars and what they did when they came into the market. And they were low end and they were disrespected, and suddenly they launched a Lexus and everybody went, whoa. That's actually profound and different and challenges at the top end, and that's what we're seeing. And of course they dominate the supply chain. Again, 15 years of very intentional development, almost like they knew what direction they wanted to go, and the electrotech revolution. And then here you see it in the numbers. I'm afraid this is final energy for anybody who reads or follows what I do. I hate primary energy, and I don't hate the energy, I hate the use of the statistics. We're going to talk about that. I actually also hate final energy, because final energy is actually the energy in the petrol or diesel you put in the tank, and not the motive power that you actually use in the wheels. So even final energy is not final. These statistics are named to confuse. But that's final energy, and you can see China is already quite clearly doing something very different from Europe and the US, and by the way, also Australia. One of the things I did at the beginning of the year was on cleaning up was to say, we want to spend more time on what we're calling most of world. Actually, it was Lord Brown that coined the phrase on one of our episodes. Lord Brown, former CEO of BP. And most of world, why do I call it that? I think rest of world in a way is disrespectful, because it's 70% of the population, and it's all of the demographic growth, and it's most of the energy demand growth, other than AI data centers, happens in countries that are not US, China, Europe. So here we are, Australia also counts in most of world, but it's really, what I'm thinking of is places like Southeast Asia, and I've just come from Singapore, and we'll be doing more episodes. I've actually got somebody who's going to be hosting some episodes out of Singapore, because we've got to focus on countries like the Philippines and Indonesia and Vietnam and Thailand, and of course also the subcontinent, so South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, because those are going to be, there's so much going on there, and we miss it if we just think it's US petrostate versus China electrostate versus European state of confusion, we're going to miss 70% of what people are doing in the world. And what are they doing? Exactly the same. They're adding wind and solar to their grids. They're buying electric cars. I was at actually it was a closed door session for a very major European conglomerate. It was their advisory board, and I'd been asked to come in and provoke. And they also had a professor of energy, and he said he was very fossil-y, complete with twirly moustache. And he said, we have to understand, no one in Africa is going to buy an electric car. And luckily, he spoke before me and had Wi-Fi. So I created this chart. 60%, 70%, they're doing exactly the same things. They're making the choices, and they're doing it, of course, in those countries because of the economics. Right? These are not countries that can have a carbon price and do things because they're woke and so on. Europe is in, I don't want to say disarray, I call it a state of confusion. But this is the Antonio Gramsci. I had a presentation where I quoted Margaret Thatcher and Gramsci, the co-founder of the Italian Communist Party. The old is dying and the new struggles to be born. And in this interregnum, a variety of morbid symptoms appear. What is the most important and severe morbid symptom? It's this. That is the European electricity price for business. That is USA, that is China. And so Europe has to do something about that. It's not going to be able to get the electricity price down to match the US and China, but it can't be that far out. And if you think that that's bad, you want morbid symptoms, try that, the UK. Now, I did not get to plot, I didn't have the time to plot South Australia against that, but you've got an issue of electricity price, and you've got to push that down. And by the way, we'll talk about that, because electrification is one way you do it. USA, obviously going in a completely different direction, or trying to. It's interesting, if you look at Trump 1, remember the ending the war on coal. If you look at the coal statistics, it's invisible. The coal fell off the grid just as fast in Trump 1 as it did during Obama or Biden. And it's unclear whether there will be a real long-term shift. I'm not seeing anybody really. They are building a few fertilizer plants using coal and so on. But clearly the effort from the administration is going in a completely different direction. Under the surface, though, people are still installing particularly solar and batteries. Onshore wind, if you don't need federal permits, fantastic, no problem. Offshore wind obviously has come grinding to a halt. And the US is obsessed with AI and data centers to a much greater extent than here or in Europe or anywhere else. And I was in San Francisco, and that's the only thing that anybody talked about was AI, and particularly the data centers. What's very interesting is, of course, there is an increase in demand from data centers. And there you can see it. That's the percent increase based on a bunch of different estimates, but kind of aggregated. And data centers' percent growth is very substantial. Here's where it gets interesting is data centers, they get all the attention for two reasons. They're very big, they're very central, so you need big grid connection, they're very disruptive locally. Also because they're owned by the richest people in the world, who happen also to own all the social media. And so we focus on data centers. But actually, in terms of percentage growth, electric transport, because data centers globally right now is 1.5% of energy use, and it's going to double. And in the US, it's 4%, and it's going to double. But meanwhile, if you look at the energy use from transport, it's a much bigger number, and it is electrifying. As we've seen, 1 car in 4 worldwide is electric, and even if you just keep rolling out 1 in 4, because cars have such a long life, the fleet of cars continues to grow, and the electricity demand continues to grow. If you put it in absolute terms, you actually see that. That was the percent growth on the left. On the right, you see the absolute terms, and you see that data centers are actually the number 5 source of increased demand globally. Obviously higher than that in the US, given that they're going slower on electric transport and so on, and they're bigger on data centers. So maybe the obsession, but maybe the focus is right there. But as I say, it's not the biggest demand driver, but it is the noisiest and the most difficult from a grid perspective, because it's big chunks in one place. It's not distributed across economies. It's kind of like taking a modest-sized town and then saying, well, we want to build 2 aluminium smelters. And do you think that the grid can cope? And do you think that people will be okay with what happens to their electricity prices? Then, of course, they love nuclear because nuclear feels like the get-out-of-jail-free card for these tech. I feel bad calling them bros, but I mean, they are all bros, right? And they love nuclear, and they're going to be very angry when they discover what everybody discovers, which is nuclear is kind of expensive and long and complicated. And I have a nuclear engineering piece in my background. I very much hope that they succeed and get some of these, because it's fabulous to have a demand function for nuclear, somebody who's prepared to pay money, who's got lots of money, who's prepared to pay. And so they're putting demand into an industry that really hasn't had much of a, it's been sort of pushed by policymakers for geopolitical reasons or whatever. And the costs of it, when it goes wrong, have been imposed on taxpayers and your average electricity purchasers. At least now, if it goes wrong, then like Mark Zuckerberg loses a few billion, which I don't even know if that's a bad thing. But it's not, even if they succeed, going to be a climate solution. And the reason is, I'm talking now particularly about the small modular reactors, which is what they want to build. This is, if you remember that green curve of wind and solar, and supposing you wanted to build, and you've got the kind of Rolls-Royce, it's really not small modular at all, it's a kind of medium size, like 470 megawatts unit, versus normal nuclear where one reactor would be a gigawatt. And if you wanted to catch up with that green curve where it is today, using the Rolls-Royce ones, it would be 1,250 of them. If you do the Westinghouse, which is the medium-sized ones, you need 2,000 of them. And, you know, we read about these wonderful companies, Oklo, which is quoted, and its share price is soaring and doing and thising and thating. And you need 8,000 of them to catch up with wind and solar. You know, if they build 5 by 2035, that will be a big win. And so, as a climate solution, of course, by the time you did build 2,000 Westinghouses, what do you think wind and solar is going to be? It's obviously going to have grown. That green curve is not stopping. It is taking off. And you can see it's taking off even in the countries that are really trying to build nuclear. So here you've got nuclear, you know, US, China and India, they're trying to build nuclear, putting a lot of political capital behind it and resources and so on. And there you see the purple line of non-hydro renewables, otherwise known as wind and solar, that is just absolutely yomping them. Right? And so, you know, can we see some nuclear? Yes. And I know that you've had the big discussion. I suspect I'm talking to a crowd that does not believe that nuclear is the solution for Australia. Am I wrong? No, I don't think so. But this is data to show that it just doesn't move fast enough. It's not going to move fast enough. So let's have some for some data centers and try and see. And if I'm wrong and it becomes very cheap, fine. I have no problem saying, well, that was a surprise, and we have got thousands, and it's really helping with climate. You know, trust me, I can live with that. I can live with admitting I'm wrong. So, the other thing that's going on, we've talked about the crisis, we talked about the sort of the growth of the electro-tech stack, but there's also in the background this pushback against climate. You know, we've had 10 years since the Paris Climate Agreement, where climate has been in the ascendant. 1.5 degrees has been the target that everybody has adopted or had to adopt, and net zero 2050. By the way, to do 1.5 degrees, you need net zero globally, including India and including China. China 2060 target, India 2070. But 1.5 degrees, you need them all to achieve 2050. So we've had these 10 years where that has been the dominant narrative. And of course, we're in a very different world. This is Chris Wright. I'm not sure if I should say, but I usually call him Chris Wrong, because he says, there's no there. 50 years out, I'll make a bet, solar never gets to 10% of global energy. And for Australia, already, you must be looking at this going, well, we're already there. I don't know exactly what percentage you're at, and you may not be quite there, but there's this word that you need to focus on as well, which is primary. And primary energy, the IEA used to call it primary energy demand. And the reason they called it primary energy demand was a post-colonial reason. Because the advanced economies demanded that energy from the rest of the world. So it was the demand of the economy it was to get your arms around the inputs for the advanced economies. So they called it demand. But it's not demand, it's supply. It's lumps of coal, it's therms of gas, BTUs, and it's oil. It's how much you put into the system. And when you look at primary, if anybody talks to you about the moment they use the word primary or refer to it in this way, one of two things is happening. Either they don't know what they're talking about, and Chris Wright certainly does know what he's talking about, or they're hoping that you don't know what they're talking about. Because what they're trying to do is draw your eye to the front of the funnel or the wrong end of the telescope and say, we can't possibly have a transition because look how big fossil fuels are. The only reason they're that big is because they're very inefficient. They're differentially inefficient. So they will use primary energy and the difficulty to replace fossil fuels and so on to say that the transition has failed. And actually, this is, emissions growing, and over the years, in order to get to 1.5 degrees, the cut has to be steeper and steeper and steeper and steeper until eventually you need a time machine to do it, otherwise known as carbon removals. And that has failed. And the moment of time we're in is we don't have to say there is no transition, but we have to admit that that model of rapidly crushing fossil fuels has failed. Right? And then the narrative, this is Dan Yergin, it's a very prevalent narrative within and around the fossil fuel industry that the transition has failed. And now they'll use the words like pragmatism. We have to be pragmatic. But pragmatism for them means we don't do anything, because we have to accept that fossil fuels is the only way to provide the energy that an economy needs because it's so big and so on. So I want to just dig into this idea of why there is a transition. And I modeled it, I wrote about it in a piece that I wrote last year called The Pragmatic Climate Reset. This is why primary energy is so much the wrong thing to look at. If you go from coal-fired incandescent light bulb to an LED, same energy service, you cut primary energy by 95%. Same energy service, the economy is as happy, your kids are doing their homework, etc., just the same. The electric cars, you go from a fossil car to an electric car, same number of miles, 75% cut in primary energy. Same energy service, economy just as happy. Heating, same thing. You go from a boiler to a heat pump, 75% reduction in primary energy. Primary energy tells you nothing. When you hear it, push back. Primary energy fallacy, it's called. So if you actually restate, over on the left you've got the primary, that's the wrong end of the telescope, what gets thrown into, and then final in the middle, which I said I don't like, and useful. If you actually look at what is keeping the lights on, the beer cold, the MRI scanners working, the cars driving, the aeroplanes flying people back to the Philippines to visit their grandparents, all that stuff, it's already 30% clean. It's not 1 to 5, it's 1 to 3. Still a long way to go, but it's very different. Anybody who does distance running, and you're in the middle third of the race, feels very different from 20% in. So I modelled this, starting with 30%, And I said, okay, what might a transition really look like? And I said, okay, so let's have the economy grow. Let's have more people fly to see their grandparents and have more people drink cold beer and have MRI scanners in the global south. These are things people should do. I want people to do that. So 3.5% global economic growth and some energy efficiency at the demand side, so you have useful energy, the stuff we really do use in the economy, grows by a couple of % per year. And then let's grow the clean stuff, the stuff we all work on, let's grow that faster, 5% per year. It's not a forecast, it's just to illustrate what happens. Right? Can it grow faster for the next few years? Absolutely. Will it slow down after it matures? Yeah, probably. But let's just look at what happens, 5% per year. And you see the blue stuff, the red is nuclear, the blue is renewables and heat and a few other things. And what it does is it pushes fossil off the system. It's a transition. And if you think about it, when we went from analog to mobile and digital telephony, we didn't measure it by how many landlines were disconnected in 1995. We just asked how many people have got mobile phones. And in fact, the peak landline happened over 30 years after the invention of the mobile phone. Peak landline was 2006. So if you'd said in 2000, there's no transition, it's failed, it's troubled, it'll never happen, you'd look pretty stupid now. The same, by the way, when a peak horse in the US was 1920. Car was invented in 1886. So you measure a transition by the growth of the new, not the crushing of the old. And I also think, by the way, the politics of talking about how we've got to stop this and block this and destroy that and so on, it's very, very difficult. You know, for the last 10 years, okay, there was the net zero period. We're in a different political era where telling people you're going to stop them from using, whether it's coal or petrol or diesel or their boiler or whatever, is politically difficult. Not difficult, it's unacceptable. So I think we've got to talk about growing the new. That brings me to electrification. And electrification, I think, is the solution to all of the above. The trilemma. The economics, we saw what happened to Europe. Resilience, because it is produced from domestic resources. And also climate. This is, again, it's Ember. They do such good work. Actually, my co-host on Cleaning Up, Brian, is the chair and founder, one of the founders of Ember. And I've lifted this almost directly from them. Here you've got, over on the left, electrification, so the electric bit, the electrons, and over on the right, the molecules. And we could put all our effort, and we have put a lot of effort, and Europe has put a lot of effort into what I call here encleanifying electricity. But there is another dimension, which is once your electricity is clean enough, you actually decarbonize your economy faster by going that way. Taking 60% clean electricity and replacing something that is fully fossil now, and actually, because of the primary energy fallacy, maybe replacing 3 units of it for every unit of electricity has a more substantial impact on emissions reduction. In the UK, we've got Clean Power 2030, and Milliman is pushing to go up the cleanification dimension, and we don't really have a coherent plan any more than Australia does for electrification of transportation, heating, and industry. And that's the moment of time that we are here at this conference, that we need to think in a much more nuanced way about the balance between encleanification and electrification. And this was one of the charts that really opened my eyes, made me think. This is the US grid, and how much does it cost to go fully clean? And what you see is you get 85% of the way there for $125 a ton US, or less, a lot of it less. So by focusing on net zero and focusing on 1.5 degrees and focusing on 2050 zero, by focusing on zero, you immediately, your eye is drawn to doing the difficult bits, and the difficult bits are expensive. And we just don't have to have those discussions right now. If we can't do aviation, there's so much, there's a smorgasbord of opportunities right in front of us that we should be doing first. And quickly, because time matters. Carbon has a time value. Once it's up there, it stays up there. And if you look at it, this, when I say a smorgasbord, this is cars. You look at the Nissan Leaf 2011 and 2026, and you see that it is 3 times, you've got 3 times the battery, you've got 4 times the range, you've got 2 times the power, and it costs 2/3 as much as the original Nissan Leaf from 2011. What do you think that's going to be like in 2040? And here you are, you've got, what is it, 15% of sales of electric vehicles every day out of the showroom are coming cars that are not taking advantage of this trend. It's not just cars, it's trucks. I've got a business doing electric charging for trucks in Europe. I've done the numbers in N levels of detail. You can do trucks, large parts of freight, you can do today cheaper than diesel. Not all of trucking, but large parts of it. You have a champion on electrification. I was trying to get the whole way through this without using the word hydrogen. See, you also have unchampions in the news today, or yesterday, BHP stepping back from this, making a huge mistake, not just on the economics, but also on their social license to operate and their ability to hire talent, which has to be damaged by stepping back from this trend. Subsidizing diesel is not helpful, by the way. Not just transport, heating. Most people outside Australia think that you don't need heating because it's Australia. So one of my missions on the podcast is to let people know that actually it has been bloody cold the last few days, and there is a heating load, and of course there is as you go further south. And not just, even if it's not domestic heating, industrial heating, and not just low temperatures. You can electrify high temperatures, and you've got some world leaders in things like thermal batteries. So it can all electrify. Some of it will need a carbon price forever, which is nice because I'm going to be doing an episode with Ross Garner, so he'll be happy to hear that. And that brings me to the electrification staircase. Some of you will have seen, I did do this thing called the hydrogen ladder. There will be another version, but I think we're largely moving on from that conversation. We called it a staircase, but the ladder was saying, when all of the dust has settled, when all of the hype has gone away, what makes sense to do via clean hydrogen and what doesn't? This is a bit different because this is saying there's a time element. There's stuff that you can do today. There's stuff that you can do tomorrow. There's stuff you can do the day after. And the idea is to create a simple schematic for shared conversations. Policymakers, investors, executives, your angry uncle who says electrification will never work, you can then say, well, there's some of it that may never work, but there's some of it that works really nicely today. And so it also helps set some priorities. Commercial now in most places. Just accelerate it. Get rid of the barriers. Focus on barrier removal. It doesn't need subsidies. Figure out why, if something makes economic sense, like freight transport, why is it not happening? What are the barriers? The next one is the stuff that's economic, but not everywhere. You can do it in some places, not everywhere. So you push hard, but smart. Don't force people to do things that are not in their interest, whether it's individuals or businesses. And those islands of competitiveness will grow as the costs continue to come down and people become educated and financiers understand, things become bankable, the cost of capital comes down, and that will grow those islands of competitiveness will become continents, and eventually they'll move down to row A. And then you've got some things that are pilots or trials or research. And that's the area where they must be treated as pilots or trials or research. The worst thing you can do is try to roll something out prematurely, because you're imposing costs on people and businesses that have no tolerance for costs. But that doesn't mean you don't keep working on them. I'm not saying walk away from them. I'm just saying understand what is commercial and treat it appropriately in the policy environment. And that is then the electrification staircase, hopefully a useful tool to drive forward the agenda that Secretary Lean spoke about, that Luke spoke about, and that Australia is taking to Antalya into the COP process and around the world is resonating. I've been in Canada talking about it, Europe talking about it, Egypt talking about it, Singapore talking about it, Australia talking about it. This is the theme of the moment. Thank you.